What's up, GoPo? It's Mr. Smith, and this is your weekly address for September 28th. All right, so our topic tonight for the weekly address is on the Renegades of Funk presentations. I'm going to walk you through a presentation so that way there's a sample, that way that there's a guide for what I'm expecting out of you all when you start making your presentations as early as this Friday, October 2nd. Now, one thing we have to navigate here, and I know that this seems perhaps a little bit tricky for the blue team to pull off, but the blue team will be presenting exclusively from their homes, while the gold team will be presenting in class. I will make sure that as the year progresses, the next round of presentations we do, we'll make sure it's inversed, unless, of course, we're all back at Bullis together as one big group. But nonetheless, please make sure you ask questions. Don't hesitate to comment here on the video or email me or even talk to me in class this week in case you have questions for this Friday's presentations or moving forward. So sit back and enjoy Mr. Smith's Renegade of Funk presentation. All right, everyone. So a couple things I wanted to mention before we get started. First of all, a significant tip I'm going to give each and every one of you is that when it comes to your slides that you will all be presenting, there's no set order and there's no set minimum as to what you show. But I want to offer a really overarching piece of advice. Make sure that you abide by the idea that less is more. Far too often, the most significant problem I see when students present is that they have way too much going on the screen. Consolidate, keep it concise. Essentially, this is like a micro theme, but with words on a screen. So whether you're gold or blue presenting, less is definitely more. Also, pay attention to one subtle technique that I use throughout. I always animate my points as I move from talking point to talking point. Far too often, students just throw a whole bunch of words, and even adults do this too. Way too many words on the screen at once, making it awfully difficult to read and keep up with the speaker. Your top priority in this Renegade of Funk presentation is to engage us. So be engaging by interacting, by sometimes maybe pausing, asking questions. But I'll talk more in the presentation about feedback later this week. Let's get the show started. I'm super excited. I want to introduce you all to my Renegade of Funk, Daniel Webster. And this is a name that many of you may never have heard before, and I hope by the end of this presentation that you have a little bit more familiarity with Daniel Webster. Because for me, Daniel Webster is a man from the past who I respect with the utmost degree, and I truly wish this is an individual who was around today, given our current climate and given the partisanship that exists within the United States. And I hope by the end of the story, you'll have a true appreciation for Daniel Webster and what he did to make him a Renegade of Funk. Let's start with a little trivia, though, and I'm willing to give anyone who answers this a little piece of candy, maybe a favorite candy, whatever. I don't know. I'm willing, coffee if that's your preference. But let's see what you guys got. So the first thing we're going to start with a little trivia. Which Ivy League college did Webster attend prior to becoming a lawyer? And the answer, since we're not actually doing this in class, but a tip, if you're going to ask a question, make it one that the class has a good shot at getting, and make sure that you give the class time. Don't just rush the answer. The answer here, though, is Dartmouth. Webster grew up in New Hampshire, and he attended Dartmouth College, which is also in New Hampshire, and he remained in New England for the rest of his life for the most part. All right, so 4 facts. This is the first part here that I really want to cement. 4 facts to remember about Daniel Webster. The first, I already kind of alluded to this. He was a Dartmouth graduate, and he went on to a really successful law career. In fact, one of his most famous cases that he practiced was supporting Dartmouth against a Supreme Court lawsuit that challenged Dartmouth's legitimacy to stay a private college. Webster won the case, and that put him on the map as one of America's most notoriously good lawyers. In fact, at one given time before he became a politician, he was the highest paid lawyer in all the United States. Webster would go on from being a lawyer and spend 40 years of public service in the United States government. He served in 3 different capacities. He was a congressman in the House of Representatives from the state of Massachusetts, as well as a senator from the state of Massachusetts, where he eventually moved to from New Hampshire. And then later in his career, Webster became the Secretary of State, which is arguably one of the highest, most powerful positions in the American government. Key thing to realize here about Webster: he lived and was a politician throughout the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. This is during the sectionalism crisis, where the country was tearing itself apart over the issue of slavery and the expansion of westward territories, wars like the Mexican-American War. Webster was outspoken against foreign wars, including the War of 1812, as well as the Mexican-American War. But his most staunch platform as a politician was he was a fierce abolitionist, someone who denied and derided the expansion of slavery into new territories in the United States. Keep that in mind. Keep Webster's position in slavery in mind as we talk further about his Renegade of Funk stature. Lastly, this is a bit subjective, meaning it's an opinion, but Webster could be arguably considered the greatest orator, public speaker in American political history. And what makes it so fascinating to me, everything I've read about Webster's public speaking abilities, he did it all with no notes. He had no keynote. He had no PowerPoint. He had no Prezi. He had no note cards. The guy did it all off memory. Just sheer impressive quality about Daniel Webster that I thought you would all appreciate, as many of us today struggle without any kind of notes or setup, whatnot. But what makes him a renegade of funk for me is really comes down to a speech that Webster gave on the 7th of March, 1850. Again, keep in mind what I told you about the time frame. This is right in the heart of the Civil War lead up. The country was rife with sectionalism crisis. So bad were things that at one point the House of Representatives put a gag rule in place that meant that nobody could bring up any legislation or any talk about slavery whatsoever. There would soon be in the 1850s skirmishes and bloodshed over the growing expansion of slavery. So enter Webster to deliver what some would consider to be one of the greatest congressional speeches ever delivered. The setup here, the background, the context, you have to also introduce another important senator, Henry Clay, who was from the state of Kentucky. And in 1850, Henry Clay proposed a 5-point compromise to sort of quell tensions within the United States. Clay's compromise, as it was known, or the Compromise of 1850, was a cornerstone of the plan to save the Union. Clay, Webster, these were titans of Congress throughout the sectionalism period. And Webster, who we already discussed was one of the great orators of his time, and maybe of all time, was asked by Clay to deliver this speech in support of Clay's compromise. Why couldn't Clay give the speech? Well, Clay was laid up gravely ill. He would die shortly after his compromise of 1850 hit the Senate and House floors. Regardless, Webster was adamant. I mentioned this before. He was adamant against the spread of slavery. But one of the key points within Henry Clay's compromise, his 5 points to save the country and prevent war in 1850, was Clay had to compromise with Southerners in order to get them to approve this plan, which included admitting more free states into the Union. Clay, Webster were in support of adding more free states. However, to appease the Southerners, Clay added a stricter fugitive slave law. And this is where Webster demonstrated his Renegade of Funk abilities. Webster gives the speech. It took hours for him to deliver the speech. No notes, remember, no notes. And so Webster delivers the speech, and it was stirring, it was stunning, but most shocking to people was Webster was standing there in front of Congress supporting a stricter fugitive slave law. He urged people to sign the Compromise of 1850, even though it included a clause about allowing Southerners more rights to pursue runaway slaves, even entering northern states to take their slaves back. People were shocked. that Webster would speak to this and support this part of Clay's compromise because it went against everything Daniel Webster as a human stood for. However, Webster believed, and you can see the quote here, which is how he started this famous 7th of March speech, which, by the way, is the only speech in American political history that's named after the date it was given. That's how famous this speech was. I come to you today not as a Massachusetts man, but as an American. Webster supported Clay's compromise because ultimately Webster wanted to halt the beginning of the Civil War. And he truly felt, along with Clay and many others, that if there wasn't appeasement, if there wasn't compromise, a civil war could have broken out as early as 1850, which nobody was ready for. And ultimately, here's what Webster sacrifices. His reputation is tarnished. His constituents in Massachusetts, supporters of him in the North, were belligerent over the fact that Webster would support a fugitive slave law. This went against everything that Webster stood for, and as a result, he basically sacrificed his future career to ever run for president, because Webster would never again have the trust of Northern voters. So it's really a critical individual loss for the sake of his career, but he did it in the name of country. And I want you to see some of the words here that Webster delivered, and I'll read them for you. In fact, I would time out here. I would ask somebody in the class to read it if we were there. So just a heads up, I would maybe think of that when you guys present your primary sources. But anyways, I have a part to act, not for my own security or safety, for I am looking out for no fragment upon which to float away from the wreck, if wreck there must be, but for the good of the whole and the preservation of all. And there is that which will keep me to my duty during this struggle, whether the sun and the stars shall appear or shall not appear for many days. I speak today for the preservation of the Union. I speak today out of a solicitous and anxious heart for the restoration to the country of that quiet and harmonious harmony which make the blessings of this Union so rich and so dear to us all. There are the words by the man himself, Daniel Webster, and ultimately that theme of sacrifice. Webster knew when he walked into the floor of Congress that day, the Senate floor, that he would be killing his career, that he would be falling on the sword, but he took one for the team. In fact, he took one for the country, because ultimately the legacy of Daniel Webster, as a result of the 7th of March speech, the Civil War would not start for another 10 years. Now, would Webster's speech single-handedly stop the oncoming of the Civil War? Probably not. But ultimately, it did slow it down, which allowed for the country more time to build up its military, especially in the North. The North was able to build its military to defend against eventually the Southern secession. We already mentioned Webster was vilified. He lost all hopes of ever becoming president by giving the 7th of March speech. And when you think about this today, the speech itself is not something that people talk about very often, but it's still within government and within political spheres is considered one of the greatest speeches ever delivered in the Capitol. And Webster will remain, he will go down, especially as in reflection of what he sacrificed, his own personal gains, his own personal career. He will go down ultimately as one of the greatest politicians in American history. And so if I had a chance to sit down with Daniel Webster and hang out with him here in D.C., in fact, that was me at the Daniel Webster statue, which is in D.C. If you ever get a chance, check it out. It's an amazing, iconic work. They even have the 7th of March speech. You can see it on the background there above his name. They have an engraving of that speech. Awesome statue here in D.C. I want to tour the Capitol. I want him to show me his office, see around where he works, his notes, his books, all that stuff. That would be phenomenal. The second thing is I'd want to sit down and give him a piece of my writing and see what Webster thought. He was a prolific writer as well as a public speaker. And speaking of which, I would definitely want some public speaking tips that would maybe help me with my teaching. I'd bring him into Your Weekly Address. Man, how freaking cool would that be to have Daniel Webster on my Your Weekly Address segment? That would be such a great opportunity. And then I'd end things with dinner at Le Diplomat, which is my favorite restaurant in D.C. Didn't have it back then in the 1850s, but I'd take Webster out for one of their classic cheeseburgers with an egg on top. So that's it as far as Daniel Webster's Renegade of Funk status. I implore you, get out there, read about him. If you want to copy the speech, it's easy to find on the internet. Just Google 7th of March speech. But Daniel Webster will be forever my favorite American politician, and I'm glad to share his Renegade of Funk status with you guys today. Thank you for watching, and thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing some of your presentations in the near future. All right, it's over. Renegade of Funk time. I went about 12, 13 minutes-ish. So let's call it 10 for your minimum. You have to speak for at least 10 minutes, and you have to present for at least 10 minutes on Friday. And then you have to go for about 15 minutes maximum. So nothing over 15 minutes. Now, I gave you a lot of information. Remember, there's no assessment at the beginning of these presentations. However, when the Renegades of Funk are all done, there will be an assessment after the final Renegade of Funk. So you guys should definitely be taking notes during each other's Renegade of Funk. That will keep the audience active. And that means as a presenter, you're accountable for making sure you really highlight and hit some key points. But 10 minutes is longer than you'll think it is. So make sure you practice. Make sure you know where you are with time. As far as a rubric is concerned, I'll have one prepared for Wednesday. That will give you guys something tangible to look at as we move forward and hit your checkpoints. But that's it for me tonight. This is your weekly address, and I'm signing off now, bidding you farewell. As always, remember, the past shapes the future. Have a good one, GoPo.